Say something. Anything. Just don't tell me it looked like.
Her name was Dara Whitlow, and this is the story of how she went from designing fabric patterns in a rented Seoul studio to standing in a hotel corridor watching her entire marriage rearrange itself in 4 seconds, and how she turned that moment into the reason her husband's empire nearly didn't survive the year. "Say something," Dara said. "Anything, just don't tell me it isn't what it looked like." He didn't say anything. That was the part she would replay more than any other detail, more than the woman's face or the sound of the door or the way her own hand had gone flat and instinctive against her stomach. He didn't say anything, and the silence told her more than a lie would have. Betrayal rarely waits for you to be ready for it. It shows up exactly when you've stopped bracing, exactly when you've decided the worst has already happened and you can finally relax into the life you built. That's usually the moment it chooses. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever kind of day you've had, stay with me, because Dara's story is one of those you're going to want to see all the way through. And if you're the type who likes stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't lose the thread halfway. She was 32 weeks pregnant with triplets when it happened. 3 heartbeats on a single monitor, 3 names she'd been quietly testing out in her head for months, 3 reasons she'd flown into Seoul 2 days early instead of waiting for her husband to come home the way he'd planned. Dara had met June Harin at a textile trade fair in Busan 6 years earlier. She'd gone reluctantly, dragged along by a business partner who kept telling her that talent without visibility was just a hobby with better fabric. She'd been standing near a booth she didn't care about, checking her phone, wishing she'd stayed home, when a man asked her what she actually made, not what she sold, what she made. Nobody had asked her that question in years. They'd talked for 2 hours. He never once mentioned what he did for a living, and she never once thought to ask, because the conversation had nothing to do with either of their jobs. It had to do with the way he listened, like her answers actually mattered. She found out slowly what he really was. Not through him, not at first, but through small inconsistencies. She noticed the way she noticed flaws in weave patterns, threads that didn't quite match the rest of the cloth, the men who appeared and disappeared around him without introduction, the way certain rooms went quiet when he walked in. By the time she understood the shape of it, she was already in love with him, and she made the choice a lot of women in her position make. She told herself that loving the man meant she could hold the rest of it at a careful distance, that her life and his business could exist as 2 separate rooms in the same house. For 6 years, that arrangement had mostly held. She built her design studio from almost nothing into something with a real name in Seoul's fashion circles. She kept her clients separate from his world. She believed, the way people believe things they need to be true, that whatever he did after he left their apartment in the mornings had no bearing on who he was when he came home. She believed that right up until the moment the hotel room door opened, and a woman she'd never seen before stepped out adjusting her dress with the particular ease of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, and looked at Dara's stomach and said nothing at all. The flight to Seoul had been Dara's idea, a surprise 2 days ahead of schedule, arranged without telling June because she wanted to see his face when she told him in person rather than over a video call with bad lighting and a 6-second delay. She had the sonogram printed and folded into an envelope in her coat pocket. 3 shapes on grey film, 3 heartbeats the technician had let her listen to twice because he could see how much she needed the second time. She had built her life in Seoul carefully, room by room, the way she built everything. Her studio occupied the 2nd floor of a converted hanok in a quiet neighborhood near the river, 4 employees, a growing list of clients that now included 2 department stores, and more recently, a contract with a state-linked manufacturing group that had taken 18 months of careful relationship building to land. She was proud of that contract in a specific, private way. It was the first piece of her business that felt entirely separate from June's world, built purely on the strength of her own portfolio and the patience of someone who understood that trust with government-adjacent partners moved slowly and had to be earned in full. She had not asked June what he actually controlled, not directly, not in years. She knew enough. She knew that his company, on paper a logistics and freight consolidation firm operating out of Incheon, moved more than shipping containers. She knew there were men around him who did not behave like ordinary employees, who checked exits before they checked menus, who called him something closer to a title than a name. She had decided, early in the marriage, that this was the one part of him she would not investigate the way she investigated everything else. It was the single room in the house she kept the door closed on, and for 6 years that decision had felt like maturity rather than avoidance. June, for his part, believed he had built something worth protecting by keeping her separate from it. He gave her space, funded nothing of her business directly because she had asked him not to, and treated the wall between them as a form of respect. What he had not fully reckoned with was that a wall built to protect someone can also become a place where things go unnoticed, and in the 18 months before Dara's flight touched down early, several things had gone unnoticed on his side of it that would have changed everything if he'd been looking. The first sign, though neither of them recognized it as one at the time, had come 4 months earlier, when June's longtime mentor and predecessor, a man named Choi Sang-wook, requested a meeting he hadn't requested in over 2 years. Choi had built the organization June now ran, decades earlier, from almost nothing, the way Dara had built her studio, and had stepped back when age and a bad heart made the daily operations too much to manage. He had handed control to June, his protégé, with what everyone in the organization understood to be genuine pride. June had never questioned that pride was uncomplicated. At the meeting, Choi had asked careful questions about Dara's business contracts, framed as an old man's polite curiosity about family. June had answered without thinking twice, mentioning the manufacturing group contract in passing, the kind of small detail a husband shares because it makes him proud, not because he understands its weight in the wrong hands. He did not notice the particular stillness that crossed Choi's face when he said the manufacturer's name. He did not notice because he had spent his whole life believing that respect once earned stays earned, and that a man who built something and handed it over willingly does not spend his remaining years resenting the hands he gave it to. That was the crack neither of them could see yet, sitting quietly beneath 6 years of careful walls and separate rooms, waiting for the right kind of weight to fall on it. Dara landed at Incheon at 6:40 in the evening, took a taxi straight to the Joseon Palace without calling ahead, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor with the sonogram envelope pressed flat against her palm, the way you hold something you're afraid of creasing. She had texted the front desk concierge earlier that week under false pretense about flowers, just to confirm the room number June had mentioned during a call 3 days prior. She knew exactly where she was going. The corridor was quiet in the specific, pressurized way expensive hotels manage, carpet swallowing sound at its edges, low golden light making everything feel slightly unreal. She reached suite 1412 and raised her hand to knock, and the door opened before her knuckles touched the wood. A woman stepped through first, not Korean, not staff, dressed in a dark blazer that read more like fieldwork than glamour, hair pulled back, no makeup to speak of. She looked at Dara, looked at her stomach, and something crossed her face that wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to calculation, the look of someone doing quick math about what her presence in this doorway had just cost someone else. She said nothing. She walked past Dara down the corridor at a pace that wasn't rushed, which somehow made it worse. June stood in the doorway behind her. His tie was gone, his collar open, and there were papers visible on the desk behind him, not a bed turned down, not wine glasses, papers. Spread out in the specific organized chaos of financial documents mid-review. He looked at Dara, and his face did the thing faces do when the mind hasn't caught up to what the eyes are seeing yet. Dara, just her name, no explanation ready because he hadn't imagined needing one. She didn't ask who the woman was. She didn't ask what the papers were. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to memorize the moment, and then she took the envelope out of her coat pocket and set it on the narrow console table by the door, next to a small dish of hotel mints, precisely the way you set something down when you want it found later by someone who has to sit with what it means. She turned and walked back toward the elevator. He said her name a second time, closer now, following. She pressed the call button. Dara, wait, let me explain. It isn't. The doors opened. She stepped in, She kept her eyes on the middle distance the way you do when looking at someone would cost you something you can't afford to spend right now. The doors began closing, and she heard him say her name a third time. With a fracture in it, she had never once heard from him in 6 years. And then the doors sealed and the elevator dropped, and she was alone with 3 heartbeats and the sound of her own breathing. She made it through the lobby. She made it to the taxi stand. Her knees nearly gave out at the curb, and she gripped the cold metal railing with both hands until a cab pulled up, and she gave the driver the address of her studio manager, Priya, who kept a spare room above the workshop for exactly this kind of emergency, though neither of them had ever said out loud what kind of emergency they meant. She didn't cry until the cab pulled away from the hotel, quietly, the specific unglamorous crying of someone who is very tired and has been holding something for longer than she realized. One of the Barbies shifted against her ribs. She pressed her palm flat there. "I know," she said, to no one, to all 3 of them. What she didn't know yet, sitting in that taxi with her whole understanding of her marriage in pieces, was that the woman who had just walked past her without a word wasn't there for June's affections at all. She was there for his financial records, working undercover for an international task force that had spent 8 months tracing a manufacturing fraud scheme back through exactly the kind of state-linked contracts Dara's own studio had recently signed, and the investigator had been 3 sentences into asking June precisely how much he knew about his wife's newest client when the door opened and everything derailed. June did not sleep that night. He sat in the suite with the sonogram photo in his hands for the better part of an hour before he understood what he was actually looking at, not the shapes on the film. He'd understood those immediately, but the fact that she had come 2 days early specifically to give him this, and had instead watched a stranger walk past her wearing the particular ease of someone who had just spent 40 minutes inside his hotel room asking questions. He called his head of operations, a man named Baek Jae-hoon who had been with him for 9 years, and told him to find her, not the investigator, his wife. She left the hotel around 8, Baek said within the hour. Taxi, headed toward Mapo. I can have someone confirm the address by morning. Don't approach her. I need her location, not her attention. By 6 a.m. Baek had confirmed she was staying above her studio manager's workshop. June sat in a car 2 streets away for 40 minutes, composing and discarding explanations before telling the driver to take him back to his office instead. Showing up unannounced at dawn to deliver an explanation he hadn't fully sorted through himself felt like exactly the kind of mistake that would cost him more than the silence already had. What he didn't yet understand was the shape of what had actually happened in that hotel room. The woman's name, as far as his organization's records could determine within the first day, was Myril Anand, credentialed as a financial consultant for a Singapore-based firm that on closer inspection by his own analysts didn't check out cleanly. By the second day, Baek had confirmed what June had begun to suspect. She wasn't freelance. She was attached to a joint task force investigating fraudulent export documentation tied to 3 state-linked manufacturing groups, one of which had signed a contract 18 months earlier with a small, well-regarded textile studio run by an American designer named Dara Whitlow. June read that sentence twice before the full weight of it landed. His wife's business, the one thing she had built entirely outside his world, insisting on keeping it that way for 6 years, had unknowingly signed a contract with a manufacturing partner already under quiet federal scrutiny, and someone investigating that partner had gone looking for a way into June's financial network and found the door standing open through his own wife's paperwork. He thought about the meeting 4 months earlier with Choi Sang-wook. He thought about the careful, unhurried questions about Dara's contracts, phrased as an old man's proud curiosity. He called Baek back within the hour. Pull everything on the manufacturing group Dara's under contract with. Full ownership history, every name attached to the founding paperwork. It took Baek most of the day. What came back made June go very still in his office chair. The manufacturing group's original licensing had been quietly restructured 3 years earlier, routed through 2 shell entities before landing with its current ownership. One of the intermediate entities, dissolved within 8 months of its creation, had been registered to an address June recognized immediately because he had visited it a dozen times as a younger man, learning the business from the ground up. It was Choi's old residence in Ilson. He set this up, June said, mostly to himself. Before he even stepped back, he built it in ahead of time. Beak didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of confirmation. Then, if the task force traces the ownership the way we just did, it doesn't just implicate the manufacturing group. It puts your wife's studio in the middle of a federal fraud investigation, whether she knew anything or not. June sat with that. Dara had spent 6 years keeping her business separate from him, specifically so nothing in his world could ever touch hers. And it had been touched anyway, quietly, years before she ever signed the contract, by a man who had once taught June everything he knew and had apparently spent his retirement building a trap disguised as a gift. He called her that afternoon. She let it ring 4 times before answering, her voice flat and careful, the voice of someone managing her own temperature by force of will. "I'm not ready to talk about the hotel." "This isn't about the hotel," June said. "It's about your contract with Hanwari Manufacturing. I need 15 minutes, not to explain myself, to tell you what I found." The silence on her end lasted long enough that he thought she'd hung up. Then, "There's a cafe near my studio, tomorrow morning, 15 minutes exactly." The cafe was small and quiet, tucked below street level near the river, the kind of place that filled with laptop workers by 9 and emptied out an hour later. Dara was already seated in the back when June arrived, coat still on, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. She looked like someone who had made it through something and was still in the process of making it through it. 15 minutes, she said, not looking up. He sat across from her and told her everything without softening it. The woman in the hotel room hadn't been what it looked like, not an affair, an investigator working a fraud case connected to Hanwari Manufacturing, the same group Dara had spent 18 months courting as a client. He told her about the ownership restructuring 3 years earlier, the 2 shell entities, the address in Ilson that traced back to Choi Sang-wook, the man who had built June's entire organization and handed it to him with what June had always believed was uncomplicated pride. Dara's face didn't do what he expected. It went very still instead, the specific stillness of someone processing something too large to react to in real time. "He set up my contract," she said slowly, "before I ever signed it, years before I even met the manufacturing group's representatives." "It looks that way." Why, it wasn't really a question about motive. She could work that out herself. It was something more specific, something closer to disbelief that the mechanism had been that patient. "Because it gave him a lever," June said. "Something connected to me that I had no visibility into and no ability to protect, because I didn't know it existed until yesterday." She looked at her cup. "So the task force investigating Hanwari is going to trace the ownership the way your people did. Eventually, maybe already has started. And when they do, my studio's name comes up in a federal fraud file, not because I did anything, because I signed a contract with a company that turned out to have your former mentor quietly embedded in its ownership history 3 years before I ever heard of it." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, working through it with the same methodical attention she gave a flawed weave pattern, looking for where the thread had actually broken versus where the damage merely showed. "The investigator, Myril, she wasn't there for you specifically. She was there because Hanwari's ownership trail eventually touches accounts connected to my company. My name came up in her investigation independent of you. She came to ask what I knew about my wife's newest client." He paused. "She'd asked maybe 3 sentences of that question when you knocked." Dara absorbed that. 6 years of careful separation, of keeping her business entirely her own, undone not by anything she had done, but by a wall June had built around her that had a door in it she never knew about, cut in years before she arrived. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "My studio's reputation took 4 years to build in a market that didn't trust an outsider with anything at first. If that reputation ends up folded into a mafia financial investigation because of your world's history, not mine, I lose everything I built completely separate from you. That's not negotiable. I need it protected. I'm already working on it. My attorney's reviewing every document tied to your contract to establish a clean timeline, one that shows definitively you had no visibility into the ownership restructuring. That's not the same as protected. No, he admitted, it's not yet. She stood, pulling her coat tighter, and he understood the 15 minutes were over, at least the practical portion of them. I'll call you about the documentation, she said. The rest of it, the hotel, what I felt standing in that corridor before I knew any of this, that's not something you get to fix with an explanation, even a true one. She walked out into the ordinary morning traffic of the neighborhood, and June sat at the table for a long moment before his phone buzzed. Beek. We have a problem, Beek said. Choi's people know we found the Ilson connection. Someone inside your financial office flagged the query when we ran it yesterday, which means it went back to him within hours. How exposed are we? Exposed enough that if he decides to move before we're ready, it won't just be a paperwork trail anymore. Beek's voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering news he didn't want to deliver. He'll have reason to move on her directly, not the business. Her. Whatever you think is coming next in June's fight to protect what's left of his marriage and his organization both, stay close, because Choi's next move is going to force June into a decision he has spent 15 years avoiding, and it's going to happen faster than either of them is ready for. Choi Sang-wook did not move carelessly. He never had. What Beek's people uncovered over the next 2 days wasn't a direct threat, but something colder and more deliberate. A pattern of financial pressure applied not to June's operation, which was too well defended, but to Hanwari Manufacturing itself, timed precisely so that the task force's investigation would accelerate rather than stall. Choi wanted the fraud case to move quickly, publicly, and messily, and he wanted Dara's studio caught inside it when it did. The reasoning, once June finally understood it, was almost unbearably simple. Choi had built the organization from nothing across 3 decades, survived 2 wars with rival networks, and had handed it to June not because he'd stopped wanting it, but because his heart condition had made the decision for him. He had told himself for 2 years that stepping back gracefully was the dignified choice. What he had actually done, Beek's research suggested, was spend those 2 years watching June run the empire with the easy confidence of a man who had never had to fight for any of it, and the resentment had calcified into something patient and precise. He doesn't want the organization back, Beek said, laying out the timeline in June's office on the 3rd day. He's 68, his heart is failing. He wants you to lose it the way he thinks he never got the chance to lose anything, publicly, completely, in a way that erases what you built on top of what he built. Dara's studio getting swept into a federal fraud case does that. It makes you the man who couldn't protect his own household while running an empire. June sat with that. He thought about the meeting 4 months earlier, Choi's careful questions about Dara's contracts, the pride in his voice that June had never once questioned. He thought about 15 years of trusting a man's intentions simply because that man had once been generous with him. The next blow came from a direction neither of them expected. Dara called him on the 4th evening, her voice different than it had been in the cafe, tighter, moving fast. 2 of my manufacturing partners just pulled their contracts. Not Hanwari, the other 2, the department stores I've worked with for 3 years. A breath. Someone leaked to them that my studio's under federal review. It's not even true yet, and it's already costing me everything I spent 4 years building. I'm going to fix this. You keep saying that. Her voice cracked slightly, the first time he'd heard it do that since the hotel. I built this without you on purpose. I kept it separate so that whatever happened in your world could never touch what was mine, and it's gone anyway, because of a man I've never met, doing something to punish you that's landing entirely on me. He had no answer for that, because she was right, and there was no version of being right that made it less true. That night June received a call from an unfamiliar number. A man's voice, calm, unhurried, identified himself only as speaking on Choi's behalf. The message was brief. Choi wanted a meeting, not a negotiation over territory, not a demand for money. He wanted to discuss, the caller said carefully, the terms of a public accounting. June understood immediately what that meant. Choi intended to make the fraud case, Dara's ruined contracts, and the collapse of June's marriage into a single public narrative, delivered somewhere June couldn't control the frame of it, somewhere with witnesses who mattered. He went to Dara that night, uninvited, and stood outside the workshop where she was staying until Priya let him in out of what looked like reluctant pity more than welcome. Dara was sitting at a work table, surrounded by fabric swatches she wasn't really looking at, and when she saw his face, she knew before he said anything that whatever was coming next was worse than what had already happened. "There's something you need to know," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what you think of me for any of it." He told her about Choi, about the 2-year quiet construction of the trap, about the call that evening and what a public accounting likely meant. She listened without interrupting, her hands very still on the table, and when he finished, she looked at the fabric samples in front of her, 4 years of work reduced to something that could unravel in a single public afternoon because of a fight that had nothing to do with her. "He's going to use my exhibition," she said quietly. June looked at her. "What exhibition?" "My gallery opening, 3 weeks from now. The first solo showing of my own collection, the thing I've been building towards since before I ever met you." Her voice was very flat now, very controlled, the voice of someone doing arithmetic she didn't want to be doing. "It's public. It has press. It has exactly the kind of room a man like that would want for a public accounting." Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood continued, entirely indifferent to what was collapsing inside the workshop walls. For 2 days, Dara considered canceling the exhibition entirely. It would have been the easiest thing, the safest thing, to postpone the one event Choi seemed to be circling and remove the stage before he could use it. Priya argued for exactly that, sitting across from her in the workshop, with the kind of blunt affection only a longtime business partner earns the right to use. "Cancel it, reschedule for the fall. Nobody remembers a postponed opening." "He'll find another room," Dara said. "If not the gallery, it's my next client meeting, or the moment the task force formally names Hanwari. Or some other stage I don't get to pick. At least this one is mine." It was a call from an unexpected source that clarified her thinking. Myril Anand called her directly, identifying herself properly this time, apologizing with clinical brevity for the hotel encounter and its cost, and then getting to the point. The task force's investigation into Hanwari had accelerated faster than anyone anticipated, not because of anything June's organization had done, but because someone had been feeding them documentation anonymously for the past week. Documentation that traced the shell entities directly back to Choi's old address in Ilson. "Someone wants this to come out publicly and soon," Myril said. "If it's not you, and it's not your husband's people, that leaves the person who set the shells up in the first place, which suggests he's trying to control the timing and the frame before we get there independently." Dara sat with that for a long moment after the call ended. She had spent 6 years believing the safest thing she could do was keep her business as far from June's world as geography and paperwork allowed. She understood now, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that the wall had never actually protected her. It had only kept her from seeing the threat coming until it was already standing in the room. "I'm not hiding from this," she told Priya. "I'm not letting a man I've never met decide how my exhibition gets remembered. If he wants to use that room, then I'm going to be the one standing in it when he tries." June, for his part, had been running his own version of the same calculation. Beek had proposed pulling every available resource to physically secure the gallery, turn it into a fortress disguised as an art opening. June had rejected the plan within an hour of hearing it. "If we turn her exhibition into a security operation, we've already let him win the frame," June said. "He wants this to look like my world swallowing hers. I'm not going to hand him that image on a silver tray by filling her gallery with visible security. What he did instead was quieter and took most of the remaining 2 weeks. He met with his attorney and finalized documentation, proving, cleanly and independently, that Dara's contract with Hanwari had been signed before any restructuring irregularities existed in any form she could have known about. A timeline built specifically to withstand public scrutiny rather than merely satisfy a private audit. He met with Beek and traced, methodically, every thread connecting Choi's shell entities back to their origin, building a case not to destroy the man who'd once been his mentor, but to remove any ambiguity about who had actually built the trap. And on the 9th day, he did something he had never done in 15 years of running the organization Choi built. He called a meeting of the network's senior partners, not to negotiate territory, but to tell them plainly what Choi had done, framing it not as a betrayal to be avenged privately, but as a liability the entire network needed to understand before Choi could control how they heard about it. The partners' reception was not warm. Choi had built relationships with several of them decades before June existed in their world at all. But by the meeting's end, 2 of the more cautious among them had agreed to withhold support from Choi if he moved further, not out of loyalty to June exactly, but because a man willing to sacrifice an innocent woman's business to settle a personal grievance was, by their own calculus, too unpredictable to back. Dara heard about the meeting secondhand, from Beek rather than June directly, and when she called June that evening, her voice had shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but less braced. "You didn't ask me before you did that." "It wasn't your fight to authorize," June said. "It was mine to own. What happens at the gallery in 12 days, that part is yours. I'm not going to walk into your exhibition and take that from you the way everything else in the last 3 weeks has already been taken." She was quiet for a moment. 12 days, she said finally, and it wasn't agreement exactly, but it wasn't refusal either. It was the sound of someone deciding to stand her ground on her own terms, with him beside her rather than in front of her, for the first time since the hotel door had opened. The gallery occupied a converted warehouse space near the river, white walls and careful lighting designed to make Dara's textile work the only thing in the room worth looking at. Press had been invited weeks earlier, along with clients, 2 department store buyers, and a small list of names from June's world that Dara had specifically asked to be included, because if this was going to be the room Choi chose, she wanted witnesses who mattered on both sides of her life, not just her own. She stood near the entrance in a dress made from her own collection's opening piece, a deep indigo weave she'd spent 4 months perfecting, and watched the room fill. June stood near her, not hovering, not performing protection, simply present the way she had asked him to be. Choi Sang-wook arrived 40 minutes into the opening, alone, in a dark coat, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he still controlled the room even from its edges. He didn't approach the featured pieces. He drifted toward the small cluster of press near the back, and Dara understood immediately what he intended to do, deliver his version of events quietly to exactly the right 2 reporters before anyone could stop him. She crossed the room before he reached them. "Mr. Choi," she said it clearly enough that several heads turned. "I don't think we've been properly introduced, given how much attention you've paid my business over the last 3 years." Choi's expression didn't crack, but something in his posture recalibrated. The look of a man realizing the room's center of gravity had just shifted somewhere he hadn't accounted for. "Ms. Whitlow, your work is impressive." "So was yours, apparently. 3 shell entities, dissolved within months of each other, all routing back to an address in Ilson you haven't lived at in years, but never quite disconnected from." She kept her voice level, the same controlled tone she used walking a nervous client through a difficult fabric choice. "I had 18 months of correspondence with Hanwari before I ever signed anything. I've had my attorney compile every piece of it, dated, verified, and independently authenticated, showing precisely when my knowledge began and ended relative to the restructuring you engineered years before I arrived." A few nearby conversations had gone quiet. The 2 reporters Choi had been drifting toward were now watching this exchange instead. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing," Choi said, his voice carefully even. "I'm telling the room the truth before you get to tell it a different way," Dara said. "You built a trap for your former protege using my business as the mechanism because you couldn't stand watching him run something you handed him willingly. That's not a business dispute. That's a grudge with a body count of one entirely uninvolved woman's 4 years of work." Myril Anand, present at June's invitation and standing quietly near the far wall, stepped forward at that moment, credentials visible, and addressed the small gathering with the flat clinical authority of someone whose job this actually was. "For the record, the task force's independent investigation has already confirmed the ownership timeline Ms. Whitlow just described. Documentation was provided anonymously, but forensic tracing confirms Mr. Choi's involvement predates Ms. Whitlow's contract by 3 years." Choi's composure held for another few seconds, and then, almost imperceptibly, something in his face gave way, not confession exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who understands the frame has been taken from him in front of the only audience that mattered. June stepped forward then, not to rescue Dara, who plainly hadn't needed rescuing, but to close the distance the way a man closes a distance he's spent his whole life avoiding. "You taught me everything about how to build something that lasts," June said quietly, for Choi alone, though several people nearby heard it anyway. "You never taught me this was how you'd choose to end it. I would have given you recognition if you'd asked for it honestly. You chose this instead." Choi looked at him for a long moment, something old and tired moving behind his eyes. Then he turned and walked out of the gallery without another word, and this time no one followed him because there was nothing left in the room for him to take. Choi Sang-wook, standing inside the network, did not survive the month. The 2 senior partners who had withheld support after June's meeting made their position permanent once the gallery story circulated. And within weeks, the man who had built an empire across 3 decades found himself with no organization left willing to answer his calls. He retired for the second time, this time without the dignity of a chosen exit, to a quiet house in Ilsan that no longer connected to anything that mattered. The task force's fraud case against Hanwari Manufacturing proceeded on its own timeline, entirely independent of Dara's studio, whose clean documentation had removed her from any exposure within the first week of formal review. Her 2 department store contracts, initially pulled in a panic over unverified rumors, were quietly reinstated once the true timeline became public. If anything, the exhibition's unexpected drama did more for her studio's visibility than the collection alone might have, though she would tell people for years afterward that she'd have traded every ounce of that visibility to have skipped the entire ordeal. Myril Anand's investigation closed its inquiry into June's organization within 2 months, finding no actionable connection between his legitimate holdings and Hanwari's fraud beyond the ownership trail that led directly to Choi. She sent Dara a short, formal note before she left Seoul, the closest thing to an apology her position allowed her to offer, and Dara, after some consideration, sent back a note thanking her for the documentation that had ultimately saved the studio, because some debts were worth acknowledging even when the circumstances that created them were not. June spent the following months doing something he had never made time for in 15 years of running the organization, slowing down. He handed 2 territories he'd personally overseen for years to Beek, not because the business required it, but because he had finally understood what it had cost him to believe that provision and presence were interchangeable. He stopped taking calls after 8 in the evening unless something genuinely required it. He learned, slowly and without announcement, to sit in Dara's silences instead of filling them with explanations she hadn't asked for. It took months before Dara let him move back into their apartment full-time rather than the careful, negotiated visits that had defined the period after the gallery opening. There was no single dramatic reconciliation. There was, instead, a gradual accumulation of ordinary evenings, the kind neither of them had made real space for in 6 years of keeping careful, separate rooms. Dara went into labor 11 weeks after the exhibition, 5 weeks earlier than planned, which the doctors had warned was common with triplets and which still managed to terrify both of them completely regardless of the warning. 14 hours later, in a delivery room at Severance Hospital, 3 healthy children arrived within 20 minutes of each other, 2 girls and a boy, and June held each of them in turn with the specific unsteady care of a man discovering that nothing in 15 years of building an empire had prepared him for anything that weighed this little and mattered this much. They named the girls Somi and Hana, and the boy Jiwoo and Dara, holding all 3 in the exhausted, overwhelmed hours after the delivery, looked at June across the hospital bed and said the first genuinely soft thing she'd said to him since the hotel corridor. "We are going to have to build this room together this time. No separate walls." "No separate walls," he agreed. If Dara's story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that the truth has a way of finding the room it needs even when someone else is trying to control it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are more coming, and I promise you, none of them end where you expect them to.